The past doesn't stay buried forever. Today, I want you to come with me, Jonas King, a veteran who has spent years trying to forget, because my dogs, Atlas and Luna, just uncovered something in my father's old house that refuses to stay hidden. Their ears were pricked, their bodies tense, as if they had sensed a secret breathing in the shadows. I hadn't been back here in over 15 years. The news of my father's death dragged me to this weathered wooden house clinging to the Maine coast. The air smelled of salt, dust, and loneliness. Every step across the creaking floorboards felt like walking deeper into a grave I thought I'd sealed long ago. He had been a silent man, stern and distant, and I had run from that silence into the noise of war. Now the house waited like a tomb filled with echoes I wasn't ready to face. Memories rose like ghosts. The long ride home after I wrecked the car at 16, my father gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white, saying nothing. I used to think his silence was a punishment, a verdict that I was a disappointment. That wound never healed. It lived in every room, in every pause, between his words that never came. Then Atlas began scratching at the basement door. Luna circled, whining low, her pale eyes fixed on a crack along the floorboards. At first I snapped, "There's nothing there." But the sound that came when I knocked was wrong. Hollow. Empty. As if the house itself was holding its breath, guarding something meant to stay unseen. What I discovered next would shatter everything I believed about my father. Stay with me, subscribe, follow along, because this secret is only just beginning to reveal itself. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the coastal road narrowed, the smell of brine and pine pressing into the cab of the truck. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, his sharp amber eyes scanning the blur of trees, while Luna stretched across the back seat, her husky fur brushing against the window, her pale blue eyes following every curve of the landscape. The miles behind us had dissolved into silence, a silence that felt heavier the closer we came to the place I had avoided for half my life. I told you earlier that the sound of a hollow wall had unsettled me, that my dogs sensed something in this house waiting to be revealed. But before I could even face that hidden truth, I had to pass through the front door of a childhood I never really escaped. That door was waiting at the end of this road, and every turn brought it closer. The house appeared suddenly perched on a bluff like a weary sentinel, its wooden siding stripped of color by storms and salt. Once it had been white, proud, a fisherman's stronghold. Now it sagged against the wind, gray and splintering, as if the years themselves had gnawed at its bones. I parked the truck on the gravel lane, the tires crunching over stones that remembered my father's boots better than they remembered mine. Atlas let out a low whine, his ears twitching toward the house. Luna shifted restlessly, her breath fogging the window. They could smell it already, the stillness, the dust, the lingering ghost of solitude. When I stepped out, the cold air of Maine wrapped itself around me. The cry of gulls overhead carried a note of warning. The sea beyond the cliff was iron-gray, restless, slapping against the rocks with a steady rhythm that matched the dull throb in my chest. This was not the triumphant return of a son. It was a summons, a mission I never wanted. My boots crunched as I approached the porch. The key I knew would still be where it had always been, under a loose stone by the step. My father had been predictable in that way, routine, carved deeper into him than words ever were. Sure enough, the key lay there, cold and unyielding in my palm. I opened the door and the house breathed on me. It was a stale breath, thick with dust, wood, rot, and something else, solitude maybe, or grief soaked into the boards. The air had a weight, as though time had never moved inside. I stepped into the entryway, the floor groaning under my boots. Atlas pressed close to my leg, his body tense. Luna padded in behind us, nose to the ground, tail low. Together we crossed into a place that had shaped me in silence more than in sound. The living room was frozen in time. My father's armchair, frayed at the edges, still faced the cold stone fireplace. A photograph of my mother, her smile bright and defiant against the years, sat on the mantel, faded but untouchable. I hadn't seen her face in decades, except in memory, and the sight hit me like a blow. The room smelled of old wood, of smoke long extinguished, and of a loneliness so sharp it stung the eyes. I dropped my bag by the door. Atlas sniffed the air, Luna nosed the corners as if mapping the ghosts that lingered. I told myself this would be simple, 3 days to clear the house, sign the papers, and leave. But already I felt the trap of memory tightening. The house was speaking not with words, but with its silence. Every creak was a reminder. Every shadow was a shape I had known before. I remembered one night as vividly, as if it were painted on the walls. 16 years old, reckless, stupid. The wreck of twisted metal still fresh in my mind, the sheriff's stern voice still echoing. My father had driven me home without a word. No anger, no comfort. Just his knuckles white on the wheel, the road unwinding beneath us in terrible silence. I had begged in my heart for him to yell, to strike, to do anything that would prove he felt something. But he had only driven his jaw, set his eyes fixed forward. That silence became the language of our home. It filled the kitchen when I sat across from him at dinner. It crowded the hallways where footsteps should have been. It sank into my bones until I could no longer separate who I was from what he withheld. The dogs moved through the rooms as I forced myself to walk them too. Each step stirred dust and memory alike. The kitchen still smelled faintly of salt and oil. The counters bore the scratches of knives sharpened too often. A rusted coffee pot sat on the stove, abandoned mid-life. I touched the handle and felt again the mornings when he rose before dawn, never waking me, never asking if I wanted to help on the boat. My mother's presence, gone since I was 10, lingered only in faint details, the floral pattern on a plate, the frayed corner of a curtain she had once sewn. Everything else was him, hard, utilitarian, silent. Atlas barked suddenly, sharp and low, the sound ricocheting against the walls. Luna growled softly, pacing near the stairwell. I followed their gaze to the basement door. It stood closed as it had always been. My father used to warn me away from it, muttering about weak steps and spiders. I hadn't thought about that door in years, but seeing it now sent a chill through me. The paint was chipped, the knob tarnished, yet it seemed to hum, with a presence as if waiting. I turned away, unwilling to acknowledge what Atlas and Luna already sensed. Not yet. I pressed on room by room. In the hallway, I brushed my fingers over the framed school photos. My younger self stared back with desperate eyes, a boy hungry for approval. Beside me in each picture, my father stood stiff, expressionless, a shadow masquerading as a parent. I felt the ache in my chest deepen. Every photograph was proof of a connection that had never been made. The bedrooms were no better. The guest room smelled of mildew sheets, yellowed with time. My old room was stripped bare, nothing left but the faint outline of posters long torn down the grooves in the floor where a desk had once stood. Standing there, I felt both nothing and everything, emptiness and rage, grief and nostalgia, tangling into a knot I couldn't loosen. Atlas sat by the doorway, watchful. Luna jumped onto the bare bed frame, her paws thumping against the wood. She sniffed the air, then let out a small howl, mournful and piercing. It struck me then how the dogs mirrored what I could not voice. They responded to the vibrations of this place, the echoes that pressed against the silence. They carried the weight of memory without knowing it. Perhaps that was why I had trusted them with my life in combat. They knew before I did, when something was hidden, when danger or truth lay just out of sight. I went back downstairs, drawn to the living room again. I stood before the armchair, staring at its worn arms, the fabric indented by years of his weight. I tried to picture him there, the way he sat stiffly, newspaper in hand, answering my eager words with grunts or nods. I had mistaken that stillness for judgment. I had let it define me. Now, standing in the dim light with the sea howling outside, I wasn't sure what it had been. But I knew one thing: it had hollowed me out. The dogs settled uneasily, Atlas lying by the hearth, Luna pacing near the doorway. Their restlessness bled into me. I poured myself into busy work, covering furniture, sorting books, but the silence pressed in thicker with every passing hour. Each object I touched was a relic of distance: a pair of gloves stiff with salt, a manual on engines stained with grease, a set of keys with no car attached. They were fragments of a life lived beside me, not with me. And yet beneath all that cold weight there was something else. A tremor, a thread of presence, like a sound just beyond hearing. It clung to the corners, to the walls, to the basement door that Atlas and Luna would not leave alone. The more I resisted, the more the air seemed to press me toward it. I paused in the entryway, staring at that closed door. Atlas rose silently and stood beside it, nose pressed to the cracked tail, stiff. Luna joined him, her body quivering, her ears alert. I shook my head, muttered that there was nothing there, but the words rang hollow even to me. The dogs didn't believe me, and somewhere deep inside I didn't believe myself either. I took a long breath, the smell of dust and salt filling my lungs. The house was no longer just a house. It was a battlefield of memory and silence. And the enemy I had run from for so many years was waiting for me here, hidden behind wood and shadow. I wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. But Atlas and Luna were already showing me that the past had claws, and it was scratching to be let out. I stood there, caught between the ghosts of my childhood and the weight of the present, knowing the truth was pressing closer. This was only the beginning. Atlas would not move away from the basement door. I had left him there when I tried to settle into the living room, but every time I looked back, his body was pressed against the frame nose, working furiously along the crack near the floor. Luna paced the hallway with her restless gait circling the door, as if she were a sentry keeping guard over something none of us wanted to name. Their claws clicked against the wood sharp and steady, an impatient rhythm that seemed to echo inside my chest. I told myself it was nothing. Houses like this had mice, maybe raccoons nesting in the crawl spaces. The logic was sound. But Atlas was not a dog who wasted his instincts, and Luna had never howled at shadows. They were soldiers in their own right, partners I had trusted with my life more times than I could count. Still, the rational part of me fought hard to dismiss what was unfolding right in front of me. I tried to command them back. "Leave it," I said firmly, my voice carrying the clipped authority of battlefield orders. Atlas glanced at me, ears twitching, but he didn't budge. Luna whined a low, throaty sound, her pale eyes glowing in the dim light. I raised my voice. "Enough." She paused, sat for a second as if to appease me, then rose again and pressed her snout against the crack. The house seemed to hold its breath around us, the air heavy with their defiance. I turned away, forcing myself to keep busy. I covered furniture with yellowed sheets, boxed brittle papers, dusted shelves that hadn't felt a hand in decades. But every sound they made dragged me back to that door. The whines, the soft scratches, the insistent rhythm of claws, all of it gnawed at my composure. Hours passed like that silence, broken only by their relentless focus. My patience frayed thread by thread. At last I slammed a box shut harder than I meant to, and muttered through clenched teeth, "Fine. You win." My voice echoed through the hollow rooms, brittle and sharp. Atlas froze for a heartbeat, then barked once, deep and commanding, as though giving the order himself. Luna answered with a short, high-pitched howl that prickled the back of my neck. I grabbed the flashlight from a hook by the door, its metal cool and familiar in my palm. The brass knob resisted when I twisted it, groaning like an old man unwilling to rise. The door swung open with a long squeal that reverberated in the narrow hall. A gust of damp air rose from below, earthy, sour, tinged with rust, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and seeps into your lungs. The dogs crowded in close behind me, their bodies rigid, their breath quick. I flicked the beam of the flashlight down the staircase, the cone of light catching the edges of steep wooden steps warped by moisture. They creaked as though remembering every foot that had ever dared descend them. I hesitated at the threshold. My father's voice came back unbidden, low and stern. "Stay out of the basement. Dangerous stairs. Spiders. Nothing worth seeing." I had believed him as a boy had taken those words as law. Now, standing in the doorway with Atlas and Luna pressing at my legs, I heard those words differently. They were not warnings. They were barricades. And barricades are only built to hide something worth protecting. I stepped onto the first stair. It groaned, complaining beneath my weight. The flashlight shook in my hand. Atlas was at my heel, his breath hot on my calf. Luna pressed close behind him, their bodies a wall of determination that left me no retreat. We moved together, one step, then another, the wooden treads shifting like they might give way at any second. When we reached the bottom, the air was colder, thicker. The beam swept across stone walls, weeping with dampness, across piles of fishing nets, gone brittle, lobster traps, warped in gray coils of rope stiff with mildew. It was chaos, the graveyard of a fisherman's life. "See," I whispered hoarsely. "Just junk." My words fell flat in the gloom. Atlas ignored me. He walked straight ahead, nose to the ground, tail stiff as a steel rod. Luna trailed after him, her body taut, her hackles rising. The beam of my flashlight followed them to the far wall. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Planks of rough pine darkened with age, stacked with rusted buoys, a gaff hook and chains. But the dogs were transfixed. Atlas pressed his snout between the planks, inhaling as though he could draw the secret out of the wood itself. Luna pawed gently at the boards, her nails ticking against them, her breath quick and urgent. I felt irritation flare hot in my chest. "Enough," I snapped. "It's a rat's nest, nothing more." But Atlas turned his head, his amber eyes catching the flashlight's glow, and barked once, short, sharp, commanding. It was not a bark of fear or aggression. It was the same bark he used in the field when he had located something we couldn't see, something buried or hidden. A report. A call to attention. I froze, the sound pulling me backward in time to nights when his alert had meant survival. Could I really ignore him now? I stepped closer. The dogs pressed aside but stayed near their bodies, trembling with focus. I swept my hand across the planks. They felt solid, rough with age. I tapped once with my knuckle. Thud. I tapped again, an inch to the side. Solid. Then I knocked at the center, and the sound came back wrong. Hollow, resonant, empty. My pulse jumped. I knocked again, harder, moving left, then right. Solid on both ends. Hollow in the middle. A shape began to form in my mind, rectangular, tall. The breath caught in my throat. I whispered to no one, "It's a door." The dogs whined in unison, their bodies vibrating with urgency. My flashlight beam darted across the planks again, and now I saw what I had missed before: the seams. Too tight, no nail heads visible. A section crafted not to be seen but to be hidden. My hand tightened around the flashlight, then shifted to a crowbar leaning against the stone support beam. Its weight was familiar, heavy with promise. I wedged it into a seam and heaved. The wood groaned, resisting with a scream of rust and age. Splinters rained down. Atlas barked once more as if to drive me forward. I adjusted my grip, planted my feet, and shoved harder. The plank snapped outward, a nail shrieking free. Dust burst into the beam of the flashlight, swirling like disturbed ghosts. My breath came in ragged gasps, my arms trembling. I pulled again, harder, and the entire section of plank swung inward, with a crack that shook the foundation. The wall was no wall at all. It was a door, perfectly concealed, masterfully built. Beyond it stretched a void, a rectangle of blackness, so complete it seemed to swallow the light. The air that seeped from it was different, drier, warmer, tinged with sawdust and resin, as though a forest had been buried alive behind those boards. I stood frozen, crowbar limp in my grip, heart hammering against my ribs. Atlas sat down at my side, calm now, his mission complete. Luna pressed against my leg, her body trembling, her gaze fixed on the dark opening. I raised the flashlight, the beam trembling in my hand, and pointed it into the void. A single wooden step gleamed back at me, clean, untouched by damp or mold. Behind it, more steps descended into a passage. My mouth was dry, my body caught between terror and fascination. The house had been keeping secrets all along, and my dogs had dragged them into the light. I took one breath deep and steadied, the taste of salt and dust thick on my tongue. Then I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the darkness my father had sealed away. And in that moment, the silence of the past gave way to something else entirely, the pulse of discovery, the tremor of truth waiting to be uncovered. This was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a labyrinth of secrets. And I had just opened the first door. The beam of my flashlight trembled as it cut through the darkness beyond the hidden door. The dogs waited, Atlas steady at my side, Luna quivering with restless energy, their bodies pressed close as if guarding me against what lay ahead. The air inside was different, drier, carrying with it the faint resinous sweetness of pine and cedar, a scent that clung to memory more than to the present. I stepped forward, cautiously ducking beneath the low frame, my boots touching smooth planks instead of damp stone. It was like crossing into another world. The passage was narrow, the walls paneled in pine, the seams fitted tight with a craftsman's care. 3 steps in it opened into a room. I stopped, stunned, the sight before me so alien to the house above that for a moment I felt unmoored, as if I had stumbled into someone else's life. I fumbled along the wall, my fingers grazing a toggle switch, and when I flipped it, a single bulb flickered alive overhead. A warm golden light filled the space, chasing away the shadows and revealing the truth my father had hidden for decades. It was a workshop, not the chaotic sort, but a sanctuary of order and precision. Along one wall, a massive pegboard held an array of tools, each in its perfect place, with white outlines painted behind them like shadows waiting for their owners. The chisels gleamed in a row, their wooden handles darkened by years of use, arranged by size with military discipline. Planes of brass and mahogany shone like relics. A long workbench stood in the center, its thick maple top scarred and stained but wiped clean, ready for the next project. The smell of linseed oil and sawdust filled the air, warm and strangely comforting. I stood frozen, struggling to reconcile this place with the man I had known. My father, the silent fisherman with calloused hands and a granite jaw, had built this refuge in secret. He had carved order and beauty out of silence, hiding it from me and from the world. It was a language I understood now, too late. a discipline as precise as soldiering, but born of creation, not destruction. Atlas padded forward, nose low, sniffing at the base of the workbench. Luna's tail swept the air as she moved to a shelf lined with objects. I followed, my breath shallow. The shelves were crowded with carved animals, a bear, a deer, a wolf, each sanded smooth, simple, yet perfect, waiting, perhaps, for paint. On another shelf, I found a delicate bird, its wings half unfurled, every feather etched with patient precision. My fingers brushed over its form, light as a whisper, and I felt the warmth of hours poured into it. Above the workbench, pinned to a corkboard, were blueprints. Not crude sketches, but detailed drawings, lines, precise measurements, exact, the handwriting neat and controlled. There was a rocking chair, elegantly curved. A boat, slim and swift, drawn with the same care he once gave the Sea Star. A child's rocking horse with notes about joints and carvings, tiny details in the main. My throat tightened as I read the margins. This was not the work of a man indifferent to life. This was a man dreaming, building, imagining futures he never shared with me. I turned slowly, taking in the room. Every tool polished, every surface wiped clean, every project carefully placed. This was not a hobby. It was a refuge, a sanctuary carved into the foundation of a house that had otherwise been heavy with silence. I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, years of assuming his silence meant contempt. Here was proof that silence had been his shield, not his weapon. Then I saw it on the workbench, a leather-bound book worn smooth at the corners, the spine cracked and creased. It had been handled often, maybe every day. My breath caught. My father had never been a man of words, but here was a book filled with them. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I pulled it closer. Atlas sat down at my feet. Luna pressed against my leg as if sensing the moment. I opened the cover. The first page was blank. The second bore a date, May 4th, 1999. The handwriting was his, tight, controlled, deliberate. The entry was simple technical notes about oak versus pine, for cabinets the durability of dovetail joints. I turned the page. More notes. Measurements, observations about wood grain repairs for neighbors' furniture. A craftsman's log, detailed and meticulous. But as I read further, I began to find something else. Between the lines of technical discipline were fragments of something more fragile, more human. September 30th, 2005. A storm is coming in from the north. The wind sounds like it's telling a story. Wish you were here to listen to it with me, Mary. I froze. Mary, my mother. She had been gone since I was 10, her absence a hole neither of us could fill. And here he was, writing to her as though she were still alive, speaking words he never said aloud. I turned the page with shaking hand. March 5th, 2007. The boy is 13 today. He's getting tall. Has your eyes. I tried to show him the boat engine, but he grew frustrated. I do not have the right words, Mary. I never have. I felt the air leave my lungs. I remembered that day, the grease on my hands, his short gestures, my clumsiness, the sting of thinking I had failed him. I had thought his silence was anger. But here, in his own words, I saw the truth. It wasn't anger. It was an inability, a weakness he could never admit. He didn't know how to speak to me. And so he wrote to her, to the wife, who could no longer answer. Page after page told the same story. Notes about joinery repairs, sanding techniques, punctuated by whispers to my mother. The boy left for the army. The house is too quiet. I turned on the porch light in case he came home for Christmas. I hope they are teaching him to be a good man. Each line struck me like a blow, chipping away at the cold, stern image I had carried. I pressed my palm to the page, feeling the grooves of his pen strokes beneath my skin. His silence had not been empty. It had been full of love he did not know how to express, full of grief he could not name, full of words he only dared write to the ghost of my mother. He had been drowning in a sea of unspoken feelings, and I had mistaken it for judgment. My eyes burned. I turned another page, reading entries that mixed the mundane with the profound. Repairs for neighbors' chairs. Notes about arthritis creeping into his hands. And then December 25th, 2010. First Christmas without him. Too quiet. I left the lights on, just in case. I closed my eyes, remembering that Christmas, on base, bitter and alone, thinking I had severed myself cleanly from him. All the while here, he was leaving a light for me, waiting. The workshop spun around me. The tools, the blueprints, the carvings, all of it blurred into the truth now heavy in my chest. He had loved me. He had been proud of me. He had just never known how to say it. His silence had not been absence. It had been a prison he could not escape. I sank onto the stool by the bench, the book heavy in my lap, my hands trembling over its pages. Atlas rested his head on my knee. Luna leaned against my side, her body warm and steady. For the first time since stepping into this house, I felt something inside me break, not in anger, but in grief, in understanding. The silence I had run from all my life was not condemnation. It was love muted and buried, expressed in wood shavings and careful lines and letters, to a woman long gone and porch lights left burning. I had been wrong. I had been blind. And now in this golden-lit room filled with the scent of pine and sawdust, the truth stood clear. The man I thought had judged me in silence had been reaching for me all along. He just never had the words. The journal lay heavy in my lap, its words still burning through me when I noticed another stack of papers tucked beneath the workbench. My hands shook as I reached for them, still raw from the revelation I had just endured. The pages were brittle, their edges curled, but the handwriting was the same, my father's, neat and exact. At first they looked like more notes about wood, more sketches and careful measurements. But then I saw the letterhead. It wasn't from a lumber supplier or hardware store. It was from the bank. My throat tightened as I scanned the lines. Loan agreements, receipts, dates that matched perfectly with the time I had ruined more than one thing in my youth. Then my eyes caught a single phrase, bold in its cold finality. Transfer of ownership, Sea Star. My heart lurched. The Sea Star. His boat. His life. The vessel that had carried our family for decades. The one thing he seemed to love more than me. I read again each line like a hammer. He had sold it not because of age, not because he was ready to retire, but because of me. Because of the debts I had left in my reckless youth, debts that could have destroyed me before I even knew what destruction meant. He had carried them. He had stripped himself of the one piece of freedom he had left, trading the rhythm of the tides for a stack of signatures, all to protect me. The room swayed around me. The tools, the carvings, the neat lines on the corkboard, they blurred as tears welled and spilled, hot and unrelenting. All my life I had mistaken his silence for disdain, and here in black and white was proof that silence had been sacrifice. Every hour he spent alone, every night without a word, had been carrying the weight of my mistakes so I could carry on free. I staggered back from the bench, clutching the papers to my chest as though they were burning. My breath came in ragged bursts, the air heavy with the scent of sawdust and resin, the golden light from the bulb flickering, as if it too could barely stand against the truth. Atlas pressed against my leg, his weight solid, his amber eyes calm and knowing. Luna whined low, her nose nudging at my hand as if to remind me that I was not alone, not anymore. I sank to my knees on the wooden floor, the tears unstoppable now. They carved tracks down my face, soaking into the papers crumpled in my hands. My chest heaved, my body racked with the kind of sobs I hadn't let myself feel since I was a boy. Atlas rested his head against my shoulder, steady as a mountain, while Luna curled against my side, her soft fur soaking up the grief I could no longer hide. In that moment, the weight of years collapsed onto me, but it was not a weight I carried alone. Through the blur of tears, I saw something across the room, a shape draped with a cloth half hidden by the shadows. I stumbled forward, the dogs at my heels, and pulled the cover back. Beneath it stood a wooden frame, unfinished, the grain pale and unvarnished. I froze, my breath catching. It was a cradle. The joints were carefully cut, the sides sanded smooth, but it was incomplete, the curved runners only half-shaped. On the headboard, faint pencil marks traced letters I knew were meant to spell a name, my child's I didn't know. But I knew this, he had carved it for a future he had hoped to see. A future with me, with a family, with life continuing, where his silence had ended. I reached out my fingers, brushing the smooth wood, and for a moment I felt his presence so strongly it was as though he stood beside me. All the words he had never spoken lived here in this unfinished piece. Love I had thought absent revealed itself in sawdust and pencil lines. A man who had been too broken to speak had built his heart into wood. The tears came harder. I pressed my forehead against the cradle's frame, my body shuddering with the force of it. Why didn't you tell me? The words tore from my throat, ragged and raw. Why didn't you let me see? My voice cracked into silence, swallowed by the workshop's walls. Only the sound of my dogs remained, Atlas's steady breathing, Luna's soft whine anchoring me as I collapsed into grief. Minutes, maybe hours passed. The golden bulb hummed faintly overhead, throwing long shadows across the tools and the bench and the cradle that would never rock. Slowly, my sobs eased into shallow breaths, my body hollowed out but lighter, emptied of rage and filled instead with something else, understanding, sorrow, love too vast to measure. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, the salt of tears drying against my skin. I looked again at the cradle. It stood unfinished, waiting a question left unanswered, and I realized then that I had a choice. I could leave as I had planned, walk away from this house and its ghosts. Or I could stay. Stay and finish what he had begun. Stay and turn silence into voice, absence into presence, brokenness into creation. The decision settled in me like stone. I would stay. I rose slowly, my hands firm on the cradle's frame, steadying myself with its weight. I turned toward the workbench, to the tools lined with precision, to the journal still lying open with words meant for a woman long gone, for a son who had only just begun to understand. I felt the silence in the room shift, not as a wound, but as a foundation. This was not an end. It was a beginning, carved from grief and lit by golden light. Atlas stood tall, tail wagging once, as if approving. Luna jumped lightly against my leg, her tongue brushing my hand. They were with me, as they always had been, soldiers of instinct and loyalty. Together, we would carry this forward. I placed the papers back on the bench, laid the journal gently atop them, and turned back to the cradle. My father's hands had begun it. Mine would finish it. Each cut, each sanding stroke would be my answer to the silence. Each piece fitted into place would be a word I never heard but finally understood. The workshop no longer felt like a secret. It felt like an inheritance, not of debt, not of mistakes, but of love disguised in labor. The truth had broken me, but in breaking it had remade me. I stood in that golden-lit room, the scent of pine and sawdust heavy around me. My dogs pressed close, and I made a vow: I would stay, I would build, I would carry forward the work of the man I had never truly known until now. The silence was no longer a prison. It was a language, and I was ready at last to speak it. When I first turned the key in the lock of that weather-beaten house, I thought I was stepping back into emptiness, into a silence that had defined my childhood and shadowed every choice I made. What I found instead was not emptiness at all, but a fullness I had been too blind to see. Behind the walls, beneath the silence, my father had built an entire world, a workshop alive, with care, blueprints filled with dreams, carvings, whispering of futures he longed for but never spoke of. His silence had not been a weapon against me. It had been a burden. He didn't know how to lay down a love too fragile to risk in words, but strong enough to endure in wood, in sacrifice, in unfinished creation. Every step I took through that hidden room changed the story I thought I knew. The tools polished and placed with discipline, the carved animals lined neatly on the shelves, the drawings of cradles and rocking horses, they told me. My father had not been cold, but careful. He had loved in the only way he could, with his hands, with his labor, with his sacrifice. The journal proved it beyond doubt. In its pages he spoke not to me, but to the wife he had lost, pouring out the words he could never bring himself to say aloud. Through those letters I finally heard his voice, and in hearing it I understood that his silence was not rejection. It was love, bound and gagged by grief, and by a life that left him no room for softness. And then there was the sea star. Learning that he had sold the very boat that defined him, that he had surrendered the freedom of the sea to shoulder the weight of my mistakes, broke me open. For years I believed I had been nothing but a disappointment. But the truth revealed something far deeper. He had carried me, even when I wasn't there to see it. His sacrifice was invisible until the papers proved it. His love was hidden until I unearthed it in the golden glow of that workshop. The cradle sealed it, unfinished, waiting, carved with care for a grandchild he would never hold. That frame of wood, pale and unpolished, was more than a piece of furniture. It was his heart laid bare. It was the hope that life would continue beyond him, that silence would one day be broken. When I touched it, I touched the man I thought I had lost long before he died. And in that moment I knew my place was no longer on the run. My place was here to finish what he began, to honor the love he had carved in secret, to build a future out of the silence that had once haunted me. Now, as I stand in that workshop, the scent of sawdust thick in the air, Atlas and Luna at my side, I feel something I haven't felt in years: peace. The silence no longer suffocates me. It speaks. It tells me of sacrifice, of devotion, of love that endured storms and losses and words left unsaid. And it gives me a choice: to continue his work, to turn absence into presence, to shape the wood until it carries both our names. But this story doesn't end here. This is only the beginning of what I found in that basement, of the lessons hidden in every line of that journal, of the mysteries that still linger in this house waiting to be uncovered. What else had he built? What else lies beneath the dust waiting to remind me of who he really was? I want you to walk this road with me. If you've ever felt the silence of someone you loved, if you've ever wondered whether their quiet was indifference or something more, this journey is for you. Share your own story in the comments. Tell me about the silence you've struggled with and whether you've found meaning in it. Hit subscribe, join Atlas, Luna, and me as we peel back more layers of this hidden life. Because if this cradle is unfinished, what else remains waiting for hands to finish it? Stay with me. The truth we've uncovered so far is only one piece of the puzzle. And I promise you, what comes next will change everything you thought you knew. Not just about this house, not just about my father, but about the way silence speaks louder than words. So tell me, are you ready to see what we find next?